Don't serve him the fresh batch. He's testing us. The whisper slid through the narrow gap behind the counter like steam off burnt coffee. Low. Quick. Meant to disappear before it could be owned. But Marcus Reed heard every word as clearly as the clink of ceramic against the chipped saucer in front of him. And for a second, his hand paused midair, fingers hovering just above a slice of toast that had already gone cold. The butter stiffening into a pale film under the dull yellow glow of overhead lights, the kind that made everything look older than it really was, like time had been sitting in this diner longer than any of the people inside it, and no one had bothered to ask it to leave. The air thick with the scent of grease and something faintly sweet, maple syrup maybe, or memory, and Marcus sat there in a worn gray hoodie, shoulders slightly hunched, blending into the line of early morning customers who came in for cheap breakfasts and quiet corners, the kind of men and women who didn't expect to be seen, and usually weren't, and that was the point, because Marcus had built places like this for people like them, from nothing but a borrowed $5,000 and a secondhand grill that barely held heat, years ago, when nobody looked twice at a young black man with a business plan and a stubborn kind of hope. And now there were over 200 locations across the country carrying his name in small print under polished logos. Though no one in this room would recognize him. Not like this. Not without the tailored suits or the boardroom silence that followed him in other spaces. Here he was just another customer waiting on toast. Just another voice in the low hum of morning orders and tired conversations. Except he wasn't, and the whisper behind the counter proved something had already shifted before he even walked in. Because that wasn't fear in her voice. Not exactly. It was calculation, quiet and practiced. The kind that came from doing something too many times to call it a mistake anymore. And Marcus lowered his hand slowly, letting the toast rest where it was, his eyes lifting just enough to catch the reflection of movement in the stainless steel coffee machine. Across from him, a flicker of white apron, a nervous glance, the subtle tightening of shoulders when someone thinks they're not being watched, and behind all of it, the steady rhythm of a place that looked normal on the surface, but felt just slightly off if you knew what to listen for, like a song missing a note. And Marcus had spent his whole life learning how to hear those missing notes, because they were the difference between what people showed and what they were willing to hide. And as the server approached with a fresh cup, her smile polite but thin, he realized something else, something colder than the toast in front of him. They weren't surprised he might be testing them, which meant they'd been through this before and still chose to cut corners, still chose to pretend, still chose to serve something less than what they promised. And Marcus leaned back, just a fraction, the vinyl seat creaking softly under his weight, the sound barely noticeable over the hum of the coffee machine and the distant sizzle from the grill. But to him it landed heavy, like a quiet acknowledgement of a truth settling into place, because this wasn't about one bad plate or one careless whisper. This was something deeper, something built into the way the room breathed. And he hadn't said a word yet, hadn't raised his voice or revealed who he was. But already, the story of this diner was starting to unfold in front of him, not in loud confrontations or dramatic gestures, but in the small, almost invisible choices people made when they thought no one important was watching. And that was always where the truth lived. Marcus did not look up right away when she set the coffee down, but he noticed everything. The way her hand hovered for half a second longer than necessary, as if debating whether to say something. The faint tremor in her fingers that she tried to mask by adjusting the handle of the mug so it faced him perfectly, practiced, precise, the kind of detail that came from habit, not care. And when he finally lifted his eyes, he met hers only briefly, just enough to register the flicker of recognition that she quickly buried beneath a neutral expression. And in that single moment, he understood that she knew more than she was willing to admit out loud, not about who he was, but about what was happening here. And that made her different from the others, because most people either ignored problems or enforced them, but she carried it quietly, like something heavy she had decided to keep to herself. And Marcus gave a small nod, nothing that would draw attention, then reached for the toast again, this time actually taking a bite, the texture confirming what he had already suspected: dry, unevenly heated, the kind of shortcut that shaved seconds off a process but chipped away at something much bigger over time. And he chewed slowly, not out of hesitation but out of discipline, letting the moment stretch just enough for the room to settle back into its rhythm. Conversations resuming in low tones, silverware tapping against plates. The distant bell of the front door chiming as another customer stepped in from the cool morning air, bringing with them the faint scent of rain and asphalt. And Marcus let his gaze drift casually across the diner, mapping it piece by piece the way he always did. The cracked vinyl on the third booth by the window, the coffee station running low on clean cups, the register drawer that did not fully close unless pushed twice. Small things that most people overlooked, but that told a larger story when placed together. A story about standards slipping, about leadership fading into routine, about a system that no longer checked itself. Because it believed no one important would notice, and behind the counter, he saw the man from the Whisper, tall, clean-cut, wearing a pressed shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow, moving with the confidence of someone who believed he owned more than his title, giving instructions without looking at the people receiving them, his voice low but firm, the kind that did not invite questions. And when one of the younger employees hesitated, unsure whether to serve a fresh plate or follow the earlier instruction, the man did not raise his voice, did not need to. He simply gave a look, sharp and dismissive, and the hesitation disappeared, replaced by compliance, and Marcus recognized that look. Instantly, he had seen it in boardrooms and back offices, in managers who confused control with leadership, who believed authority came from pressure instead of trust. And as he watched, the man turned slightly, scanning the room with a quick, practiced sweep, eyes passing over customers without really seeing them, until for a brief second, they landed on Marcus, and there was something there, not recognition, but assessment, a silent judgment based on appearance alone, the hoodie, the posture, the quiet presence that did not demand attention, and just as quickly, the man looked away, decision made, category assigned, nothing more to consider. And Marcus felt that familiar weight settle in his chest, not anger, not surprise, just a steady reminder of why he still did this, why he still walked into his own places without announcing himself. Because the truth of a business was never found in reports or meetings. It lived in moments like this, in how people treated those they believed had no power. And he lowered his gaze again, picking up the coffee, letting the warmth seep into his hands as he took a slow sip, the flavor slightly bitter, slightly off, not terrible, but not right either. And he set the cup down with care, the soft tap against the table almost lost in the noise around him. But to him it marked a quiet decision forming, not yet spoken, not yet acted on, just taking shape beneath the surface, as steady and inevitable as the morning light pushing through the front windows, illuminating dust particles in the air that had always been there, just waiting for the right angle to be seen. The man behind the counter did not introduce himself, but he did not need to, because everything about the way he moved filled in the missing details, the straightening of receipts that were already aligned, the way he adjusted the collar of his shirt as he stepped toward the register, the slight pause before speaking, as if deciding how much patience to spend on the next interaction, and when he finally did speak, his voice carried just enough edge to make the air tighten without raising in volume. "You going to eat that? Or are you just here to sit?" And the words landed, casually, almost disguised as a question, but Marcus heard the judgment beneath them, the quiet assumption that a man dressed like him did not belong at a table meant for paying customers who ordered more than toast. And Marcus lifted his eyes again, meeting the man's gaze fully this time, not with defiance, not with challenge, just presence, steady and unhurried. And for a brief second something flickered across the man's face, not recognition, but discomfort, the kind that came when a situation did not follow the expected script, and he shifted his weight slightly, tapping the edge of the counter with 2 fingers as if to re-establish control over a moment that had not yet slipped but was no longer entirely his. "We have a line," he added, glancing past Marcus even though there was no one directly waiting, just the illusion of urgency, the kind that justified impatience, and Marcus nodded slowly, setting the toast down with deliberate care, the soft scrape of the plate against the table barely audible. "It is not fresh," he said, his voice calm, even, carrying no accusation, just fact. And that was enough to draw a sharper reaction, the man's lips pressing into a thin line before curling into something that resembled a smile, but did not reach his eyes. "It was made 5 minutes ago," he replied, the tone shifting slightly, defensive now, though still controlled. and Marcus held his gaze, not raising his voice, not leaning forward, simply letting the silence stretch between them for a fraction longer than comfort allowed. And around them, the diner continued to move. A couple in the corner laughing softly over pancakes, a trucker near the window folding his newspaper with a rustle that echoed louder than it should have, the bell at the door chiming again as another customer stepped in. But at the counter, something had slowed, narrowed, focused into a space where only two people existed, one trying to maintain authority, the other refusing to be dismissed without ever saying so directly. And behind the man, Marcus caught another glimpse of the waitress, Lily Brooks, her name tag slightly tilted, her eyes fixed on the interaction with a quiet intensity that suggested she understood exactly what was unfolding. And when the man turned his head just enough to signal for her to move, she hesitated. Not long, not enough to be called out, but enough for Marcus to notice. And then she stepped forward, reaching for the plate as if to replace it. But the man's hand came down lightly on the counter, not forceful, just enough to stop the motion. "It is fine," he said, not looking at her. And she froze for a second before withdrawing her hand, her fingers curling slightly as if holding on to something she could not release. And Marcus saw it then, not in words, not in actions that could be written up or reported, but in the space between them, the quiet imbalance. The way decisions were made not for quality but for convenience, not for people but for control. And he leaned back again, exhaling slowly, the breath steady, measured, as if aligning himself with something deeper than the moment, because he had seen this before, in different forms, different places, always starting small, always justified in ways that sounded reasonable until they became routine. And he reached into his pocket, not for anything dramatic, not for a phone or a card that would change the tone of the room instantly, but simply to rest his hand there, grounding himself, reminding himself why he was here, not to react, not to prove, but to understand. And as he looked back at the man behind the counter, he saw past the pressed shirt and controlled posture, saw the pattern forming, the choices stacking quietly on top of each other. And he knew this was no longer about a plate of toast. It was about what had been allowed to grow in the absence of accountability, something subtle, something quiet, something that only revealed itself to those willing to sit long enough to see it. And Marcus was very good at sitting. Marcus let the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional, not confrontational. And then he moved, not toward the counter but slightly to the side, shifting his chair with a soft scrape that turned a few heads without demanding attention. And when he stood, he did not rush, did not carry the urgency the manager seemed to expect from someone being subtly pushed out. Instead, he picked up the plate, the toast still barely touched, and walked the 2 steps to the counter himself, placing it down with care, as if returning something that had simply been borrowed, not rejected. And the manager watched him with narrowed eyes, recalibrating, trying to decide whether this was compliance or defiance. And Marcus spoke before that decision could settle, his tone steady, measured. "May I ask you something?" And the question landed differently than a complaint would have. It did not accuse, it invited. But it also held weight, the kind that required an answer whether one was wanted or not. And the manager hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding once, sharp, controlled. "Depends on what it is." And Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the response without yielding to it. "When you train your staff," he said, his voice low enough to stay between them, but clear enough that the edges of nearby conversations began to soften. "What do you tell them matters most?" And the manager exhaled through his nose, a faint sign of impatience surfacing. "Speed," he replied quickly, as if the answer were obvious. "Efficiency, keeping the line moving, making sure people get what they paid for." And Marcus listened, his expression unchanged, absorbing not just the words but the order they came in, the priorities they revealed. And he nodded once. "And respect," he added gently, not as a correction, but as a completion. And that single word shifted something, subtle but undeniable, because it did not fit cleanly into the manager's framework, did not align with the rhythm he had established. And for a moment, the man's composure faltered, not visibly to most, but enough for Marcus to see the small tightening at the corners of his eyes, the slight delay before he responded. "Of course," he said, the words coming out a fraction too fast. "That goes without saying." And Marcus held his gaze, letting the silence return, heavier this time, filled with what had not been said, and behind them, Lily moved again, this time deliberately, stepping closer under the pretense of refilling a sugar dispenser, her presence. Quiet but intentional, as if she were positioning herself within earshot without drawing attention, and Marcus noticed, not turning toward her, but aware of the shift in the room, the way a few employees had begun to slow their movements, listening without appearing to, sensing that something more than a routine exchange was unfolding, and Marcus rested his hand lightly on the edge of the counter, the surface cool beneath his fingertips, grounding, familiar, and he spoke again. If someone walks in here, he continued, and you decide who they are before they speak, before they order, before they even sit down, what are you really serving them? And the question hung in the air, not loud, not aggressive, but precise, cutting through the noise without raising above it, and the manager's jaw tightened, his posture stiffening as he straightened slightly, reclaiming space that had begun to feel uncertain. Look, he said, his tone shifting, less controlled now, more defensive, we run a business here, not a philosophy class, and a faint ripple of tension moved through the nearby tables, the kind that made people glance up and then quickly look away, unsure whether they were witnessing something important or something they should not be part of, and Marcus nodded again, slow, understanding, as if the answer confirmed something he had already known, and he reached into his pocket, not hurried, not dramatic, simply retrieving his phone and placing it on the counter without unlocking it, without drawing attention to it, just letting it sit there as a quiet presence. And he looked back at the manager, his voice softer now, almost reflective. Every business is a philosophy, he said. You just decide whether you are aware of it or not. And the words did not land like a challenge. They settled like truth, calm and steady, and for a moment, no one moved. The hum of the diner continuing around them, but somehow distant, as if the center of the room had shifted to this small space at the counter, where a conversation that should have been simple had become something else entirely, something that could not be undone once it had been spoken, and Marcus remained still, not revealing anything more, not escalating, simply standing there with the same quiet presence he had carried from the moment he walked in, waiting, not for an answer, but for what would come next. The manager let out a short breath that was almost a laugh but carried no warmth, his fingers tapping faster now against the counter as if the rhythm could pull him back into control, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped just enough to sharpen the edge. You talk like you know how this place runs, he said, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked Marcus up and down again, measuring, categorizing, dismissing. But you are sitting here over $2 worth of toast like it is a court case. And a couple of nearby customers shifted in their seats, not turning fully, but listening in that quiet way people do when tension starts to settle into a room. And Marcus did not react to the tone, did not mirror it. He simply rested both hands lightly on the counter, palms flat, grounding himself in the moment as he answered. It is never about the price, his voice calm, steady, almost soft, but carrying clearly through the space between them. It is about what the price represents, and that answer did not land the way the manager expected. It did not escalate, did not retreat. It redirected, and for a second, the man seemed unsure how to respond, his posture tightening as he straightened fully, reclaiming height, reclaiming distance. What it represents, he repeated, slower this time, a faint disbelief creeping into his tone. It represents breakfast, nothing more. And Marcus tilted his head slightly, not in disagreement, but in observation. To you, he said quietly, and the words were not confrontational, but they carried weight, the kind that forced a pause, and behind them, Lily's hands had stilled completely, the sugar dispenser forgotten in her grip as she watched, her eyes moving between the two men with a tension that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with recognition, because she had seen this pattern before, seen how small moments turned into larger consequences, and she knew which side of that line she was standing on, even if she had not yet stepped across it. And the manager exhaled again, longer this time, his patience thinning in a way that was beginning to show. Look, he said, glancing briefly toward the door, as if considering ending the conversation altogether. If you are not satisfied, I can refund you and you can go somewhere else. And the offer sounded reasonable on the surface, standard, procedural, but underneath it was something else. An attempt to close the interaction without addressing what had been exposed. 2. Reduce it back down to a transaction that could be undone with a few dollars and a polite nod. And Marcus heard that clearly. And he shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "I am not here for a refund," he said, and that sentence settled differently. Heavier, because it removed the easiest exit from the situation, and the manager's eyes flicked briefly to the phone on the counter, still untouched, still silent, as if sensing there was more to this man than he had first assumed, but not yet able to place it. And that uncertainty began to show in small ways, in the slight shift of his stance, in the way his voice lost a fraction of its earlier certainty when he spoke again. "Then what are you here for?" he asked, and this time it was not rhetorical, not dismissive. It was a real question, edged with something closer to unease, and Marcus held his gaze, steady, unflinching, and for a moment, the noise of the diner seemed to pull back again, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversations, all of it fading just enough to leave space for what he was about to say. And he answered simply, "To see." And the word was quiet, almost understated, but it carried depth, because it was not about the toast, not about the service, not even about the manager standing in front of him. It was about everything that had been revealed in the last few minutes without anyone intending to reveal it. And the manager frowned slightly, the simplicity of the answer throwing him off balance. More than any argument could have. "To see what?" he pressed, and Marcus did not rush to respond. He let the silence stretch again, letting the weight of the question settle into the space between them, and then he spoke. "What happens when people think no one is watching?" And that was the moment something shifted fully, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably, because those words did not belong to a customer complaining about breakfast. They belonged to someone observing something much larger, and the manager felt it, even if he could not yet define it, and his eyes moved again, quickly, scanning Marcus more carefully this time, as if searching for details he had missed, something that would explain the calm, the precision, the way this man stood without needing to raise his voice to hold the room. And behind him, Lily's breath caught almost imperceptibly, her grip tightening on the counter as realization began to form, not complete yet, but close enough to feel. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, still, composed, his presence no longer blending into the background but quietly reshaping the space around him, as if the room itself had begun to recognize that something important was unfolding, even before anyone had said it out loud. The word lingered in the air longer than it should have, settling into the quiet spaces between movements, between breaths, between the soft clink of dishes and the low hum of the coffee machine that never quite stopped running. And for a moment, no one moved, not fully, not decisively, as if the entire diner had entered a kind of pause it did not know how to exit. And Marcus did not fill that silence. He let it exist, let it expand just enough to reveal what people did when there was nothing to hide behind, no orders to follow, no distractions to lean on, just the weight of being seen without warning. And he turned slightly, not away from the counter, but just enough to take in the rest of the room again. The way the early sunlight now reached farther across the tiled floor, catching the edges of shoes, chair legs, the faint outline of footprints that had not yet been wiped clean. And he noticed the older man by the window had stopped reading, his newspaper folded neatly in half-ass. He watched with quiet curiosity, not intruding, just present, and the couple in the corner had lowered their voices, their laughter replaced with something softer, more observant, and behind the counter, the rhythm had changed, not stopped, but slowed, as if each movement now carried awareness it had not held before, and Lily stood still for a second longer than she should have, her eyes fixed on Marcus, not with fear, not even with surprise anymore, but with something closer to recognition, the kind that does not come from knowing a face but from understanding a truth. And she lowered her gaze briefly, steadying herself, then reached for a clean plate, not because she had been told to, but because something in her had shifted, and Marcus saw that, the difference between being instructed and choosing, and he let his hand rest on the counter, fingers relaxed, his posture unchanged, grounded, as if he had nowhere else to be and no reason to rush what was unfolding. And the manager cleared his throat, the sound sharper now in the quiet, an attempt to reclaim control. to restart the rhythm that had slipped out of his hands. "We are done here," he said, not loudly, but with a firmness that tried to re-establish boundaries, and Marcus did not look at him immediately. He took a slow breath instead, the kind that filled the chest fully and left just as steadily. And when he did turn back, his expression was calm, almost reflective, as if he were considering something beyond the immediate exchange, and his voice, when it came, was softer than before, but carried further. "Do you know what the hardest part of building something is?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a lesson, but as a question that had lived with him for years, and the manager frowned slightly, caught off guard again, his earlier certainty slipping in small, almost invisible ways. "Keeping it running," he answered quickly, defaulting to what sounded practical, what sounded right, and Marcus gave a small nod, acknowledging the answer without dismissing it. "That is part of it," he said, his gaze steady. "But the hardest part is knowing when it is no longer what you built." And that sentence landed differently, heavier, because it was not about operations or efficiency or even respect anymore. It was about identity, about something deeper that could not be fixed with a quick adjustment or a new policy. And the manager's jaw tightened again, his eyes narrowing slightly as he searched Marcus's face for something that would anchor this conversation back into something familiar, something he could manage. But there was nothing there to hold on to. No anger, no impatience, just a quiet certainty that did not need to prove itself. And behind him, Lily stepped forward again, this time not hesitating, placing a fresh plate on the counter with a deliberate care that contrasted sharply with the earlier one. The toast golden, evenly prepared, the butter melting just enough to catch the light. And she did not look at the manager when she did it. She looked at Marcus, just for a second, her eyes steady, as if acknowledging a line she had chosen to cross. And then she stepped back, returning to her position without a word, and the manager noticed, of course he did, his head turning slightly, his attention splitting between the plate and the woman who had placed it there without his approval. And something in his posture shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the tension building beneath the surface, the loss of control he could feel but had not yet named. And Marcus looked at the plate, then back at Lily, then finally at the manager, and he did not smile, did not thank anyone. He simply observed, taking in the difference, the choice that had been made in that quiet moment. And for a brief second, the diner felt different, not because anything loud had happened, but because something subtle had changed direction, and Marcus rested his fingertips lightly against the edge of the plate, feeling the warmth this time, real, present, and he knew that whatever came next would not be about correcting a mistake. It would be about revealing everything that had allowed that mistake to exist in the first place. And he remained exactly where he was, still, grounded, letting the moment breathe just long enough for everyone else to feel it too. The warmth of the plate lingered beneath Marcus's fingertips for only a second before he let his hand fall away, not rejecting it, not accepting it, simply acknowledging that something had shifted and could not be shifted back. And in that quiet pause, the truth finally surfaced, not in a loud declaration, but in the smallest of movements. Lily leaning in just slightly, her voice low enough that it should have been lost in the hum of the room, but instead carried with a clarity that cut straight through the silence. "They changed the numbers too," she said, barely above a breath, her eyes not on Marcus, but fixed somewhere just beyond him, as if speaking directly might make it harder to say. And Marcus did not react outwardly, not immediately, but something in his posture settled deeper, more certain, as if a final piece had just found its place. And the manager heard it too. Of course he did, his head snapping just slightly toward her, not in shock, but in recognition of a line that had just been crossed without his permission. And for a fraction of a second the room held its breath again, waiting to see which direction the moment would fall. And Marcus turned his head slowly toward Lily, his expression unchanged, his voice calm when he spoke. "What numbers?" he asked, and it was not an interrogation, not an accusation. It was an opening, and that difference mattered, because Lily hesitated, not out of fear now, but out of the weight of what speaking fully would mean. And she glanced once toward the manager, then back down at the counter, her fingers tightening briefly around the edge before she answered. "Inventory, waste reports, daily sales," she said quietly, each word placed carefully, deliberately. "We log what we should be using, not what we actually use. And the manager let out a sharp exhale, stepping forward now, his voice cutting in before she could continue. That is enough, he said, the control returning to his tone but thinner now, stretched. You do not know what you are talking about. And Lily's shoulders stiffened, but she did not step back this time, did not retreat into silence. She simply stood where she was, her voice steady when she spoke again. I log it every night. And the simplicity of that sentence landed harder than anything else, because it was not opinion, not interpretation, it was fact, lived, repeated, undeniable. And Marcus watched the exchange without interruption, his gaze moving between them with a quiet focus that seemed to slow everything down, not escalating, not rushing, just allowing the truth to surface fully. And the manager's composure shifted again, the controlled edges beginning to fray in subtle ways, the tightening of his jaw, the quick glance toward the back office as if calculating distance, options, exits. And he turned back to Marcus, his voice lower now, more guarded. You are going to listen to her over me, he said, and the question carried more than frustration. It carried uncertainty, the kind that comes when authority is no longer enough on its own. And Marcus met his gaze steadily, his answer simple. I am listening to what is happening, he said, and that distinction mattered, because it removed sides, removed allegiance, left only reality in its place. And for a moment, no one spoke, the air thick with everything that had just been said and everything that could no longer be unsaid. And then Marcus reached for his phone, the movement slow, deliberate, and this time he unlocked it, not with urgency, not with tension, just with purpose, his thumb moving across the screen with practiced ease as he selected a contact. And he did not step away, did not lower his voice. He simply held the phone to his ear as the line rang once, twice, and then connected. And when he spoke, his tone did not change, calm, measured, but it carried in a way that made the entire counter feel smaller. This is Marcus, he said, and the name settled into the room like something heavy finally placed down, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And he continued, I need an audit team at the Riverside location within the hour. And across from him, the manager went still, not moving, not speaking, his eyes fixed on Marcus with a clarity that had not been there before. Because in that moment, everything he had assumed, everything he had decided based on appearance and posture and silence, collapsed into something else entirely, something he had not prepared for. And Marcus listened for a second, then nodded once. Yes, I will be here, he said before ending the call. And he lowered the phone back onto the counter with the same quiet precision he had carried from the beginning. And for a long second, no one moved, not the customers, not the staff, not even the manager, because the room itself seemed to understand that something irreversible had just happened. And Marcus did not say anything more, did not explain, did not justify. He simply stood there, present, grounded, letting the truth speak for itself in the silence that followed. No one spoke for a long second after the call ended, not because they did not have words, but because none of them felt strong enough to hold the weight that had just settled over the room. And Marcus did not rush to fill that silence. He simply rested his hand lightly against the counter again. The same calm presence he had carried from the beginning now sharpened by something unmistakable. And across from him, Ethan Cole stood completely still, his posture no longer confident, but suspended, like a structure that had not yet collapsed but had already lost its foundation. And when he finally moved, it was small, almost hesitant, his fingers brushing against the edge of the register drawer, as if to remind himself where he was, what this place had been just minutes ago. And his voice, when it came, was lower, stripped of its earlier edge. You should have said something, he muttered, not quite meeting Marcus's eyes. And the words landed strangely, not as an accusation, not fully, but as a deflection, an attempt to reposition the moment into something that could be explained away. And Marcus watched him for a second before answering, his tone steady, unchanged. You had everything you needed to know, he said, and that sentence did not raise in volume, did not push, but it settled with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes flicking toward Lily again, then back to Marcus, the calculation returning, but weaker now, fractured. You think this is all on me, he said, and there was something different in the question this time. Not just defense, but the first trace of doubt, and Marcus did not answer immediately. He let the question exist for what it was, then shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "I think this is what happens when people stop being accountable," he replied, and that shift mattered, because it removed blame from a single point and placed it into a system that had been allowed to drift, and Ethan exhaled, longer this time, his shoulders dropping just slightly, as if something inside him had finally begun to give way, and he looked around the diner. Really looked this time, not scanning, not assessing, but seeing the worn booths, the tired expressions of early customers, the staff moving carefully now, aware of every step, every glance. And for the first time since Marcus had walked in, Ethan seemed to understand that this place was not just his to control. It was something he had been entrusted with and quietly reshaped into something else. And that realization did not come with a loud reaction. It came with stillness, with a kind of internal shift that showed itself only in the way he no longer tried to dominate the space. And Lily stood a few feet away, her hands resting lightly against the counter, not trembling now, not unsure, just present, watching as the weight of the moment settled where it needed to, and Marcus turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room one more time, taking in the details again, but differently now, not searching, not questioning, just confirming what had already been revealed. And he reached for the fresh plate, breaking off a small piece of toast, the texture soft, the warmth consistent, and he took a bite, chewing slowly, not as a test anymore, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the difference a single choice could make. And he set the plate back down, then looked at Ethan again, his voice calm, but carrying something deeper now. "Do you know what happens next?" he asked, and Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes dropping briefly to the counter before lifting again. And when he finally spoke, it was quieter than before, almost uncertain. "An audit," he said, and Marcus nodded once. "Yes," he replied, "but not just of the numbers." And that distinction hung in the air, heavier than the word itself, and Ethan's expression shifted again, the understanding deepening, because this was not just about reports or procedures. It was about the culture he had allowed to form, the decisions he had made when he thought no one was watching, and the consequences of those decisions reaching beyond him now. And Marcus let the silence return one more time, not to create tension, but to give space for that understanding to settle fully. And in the distance, faint but growing closer, the sound of a vehicle pulling into the lot reached through the glass front windows, a low engine hum that did not belong to the usual flow of customers, and no one needed to look to know what it meant, because the shift had already happened, long before anyone arrived. And Marcus remained where he was, still, grounded, not as someone waiting for something to begin, but as someone who had already seen enough to know exactly where this would go. The low hum of the engine outside grew louder before cutting off completely, followed by the muted thud of doors closing one after another, not rushed, not chaotic, just deliberate. And inside the diner, no one needed to turn to the windows to understand what it meant, because the shift had already settled into the room long before the first person stepped through the door, and Marcus remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his hand resting lightly against the counter as if anchored to something deeper than the moment unfolding around him. And when the door finally opened, the soft chimes sounded different this time, sharper somehow, clearer, and 3 people entered, dressed simply but with a quiet precision that set them apart, their eyes moving through the space not as customers but as observers, noting details, absorbing the room in seconds. And Ethan's gaze followed them instinctively, his shoulders tightening again, but not with the same authority as before. This was something else, something closer to awareness, and he stepped back slightly from the counter, not retreating, but no longer occupying the space as if it belonged solely to him. And Marcus did not greet the newcomers with any visible signal. He did not need to. One of them met his eyes briefly, gave a small nod, and that was enough. A silent confirmation that everything was already understood, and the team moved through the diner quietly, speaking in low voices, asking simple questions, checking logs, opening drawers, their presence steady and controlled. And with each step they took, the room seemed to breathe differently, not louder, not softer, just more aware. And Marcus turned his attention back to Ethan, who stood now with his hands resting at his sides, no longer tapping, no longer directing, just present in a way he had not been before. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only the reality of what had been revealed. And Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice calm, not raised, not lowered, just clear. "This is not about catching you," he said, and Ethan looked at him, really looked this time, not at the hoodie, not at the surface, but at the man standing in front of him, and something in his expression shifted. Again, softer now, less guarded. "Then what is it about?" he asked, and the question carried no edge anymore, only a quiet need to understand, and Marcus held his gaze, steady, grounded. "It is about what you chose when you thought it did not matter," he replied, and that sentence settled into the space between them, not heavy, not harsh, just true, and Ethan's eyes dropped briefly to the counter, to the fresh plate of toast, to the reflection of his own hands against the polished surface, and he exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but enough to mark the moment, and he nodded once, not in agreement, not fully, but in recognition, and that was where the change began, not in the arrival of the audit team, not in the process that would follow, but in that quiet acknowledgement of something he could no longer ignore. And Marcus watched him for a second longer, then stepped back from the counter, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a small shift that created space where there had been tension, and he reached for his jacket, draping it over his arm as he turned toward the door, and no one stopped him, no one needed to, because his presence had already done what it came to do. And as he walked past the booths, past the customers who now pretended not to watch, past Lily who stood still for just a second before giving the slightest nod, he moved with the same quiet certainty he had carried from the beginning. And when he reached the door, he paused for a fraction of a second, his hand resting on the handle as the morning light spilled across the floor at his feet, and he looked back once, not at any one person, but at the space itself, the diner, the people, the system that would now have to face what it had become. And then he stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him, the chime fading into the air, and inside, the room remained, changed not by noise or force, but by something far quieter, something that lingered in the way people moved, in the way they looked at each other, in the silence that now held a different kind of weight, the kind that does not disappear, the kind that stays, reminding everyone who felt it that what matters is not who is watching, but who you choose to be when you believe no one is.